So, as we talk about plants, we're going to talk about sort of variety of structures you find within plants. We'll talk about the different types of plants, and then we'll look at what these different structures do, what their purposes, and we'll talk a little bit about how the plant kingdom sort of connects and interacts with other groups. So, we know a bunch of the characteristics of plants because we already talked about the very general things. So we know that plants are multicellular, all plants. We're thinking about here our big categories. What do we know about their nutrition? Just say the first thing that pops in your brain. Hold it for a second. Think, does this make sense? Yes, they are autotrophs.
Yeah.
What about their complexity? They're eukaryotes. They have complex cells. They have a nucleus. They have other membrane-bound organelles. So when plants reproduce, they can reproduce in both a sexual reproduction and asexual. We'll talk about how they do that in this unit. So here we have some actual plant cells, and what's the main thing about this photograph that would tell you you're looking at some plant cells? There's a few things. Cassia?
There's like the cell wall.
Yeah, you could see a pretty rigid cell wall. Colin?
They're hidden because they contain chloroplast.
You see these green circles in there. Those are individual chloroplasts within each cell. Tyler, do you have something else?
I was going to say they were green.
Yeah, and they're also that sort of box shape.
Square shape.
Yeah. And we've talked a lot about plant cells, so we're not going to get into those details again. We've already covered that. So the plant kingdom is split into sort of two very broad categories. We call them vascular plants and non-vascular plants. And probably vascular plants, do you know the difference between the two? What is that word vascular?
I've heard it in medical terms.
Yeah, it has to do because we have a cardiovascular
Vascular. Yeah,
system.
isn't it like
So cardio means our heart. What is the vascular?
blood? Pumping?
They are blood vessels. A vascular system means a system of transport. Basically, a series of tubes that carries things around. Our cardiovascular system is responsible for moving blood throughout our body inside of arteries and veins. A vascular surgeon, you may have heard of, operates on arteries and veins and so forth.
Is it truly a vascular plant?
Yep. If you imagine a plant, most likely you're thinking of a vascular plant. Vascular plants are larger plants. Non-vascular plants don't have tissue to move water around inside of them. So what that means is often they're small. They often grow in moist areas because they have to sort of be close to the water, all of the parts of the plant. So mosses, which you might see growing on the ground, those are plants, but they're non-vascular plants. They don't grow very large. They're close to the ground. They grow in damp areas because they have no way of getting water up high into, the leaves somewhere. So when you look at a piece of celery and you look at those stringy parts inside, okay, those are the vascular tubes that carry material through that celery.
Stop. I love celery. Ew. With cream cheese.
So when we talk about vascular plants, the things that need to be moved around inside of the plant include water, but also other materials as well. Vitamins, sugars that are made during photosynthesis, they have to be moved from one part of the plant to another. So vascular means vessels, ducts, tubes. And in vascular plants, there's two main types of vascular tissue. called the xylem and the phloem, and they carry different materials. So if we look at this sort of cross-section of the stem of a plant, okay, this inner layer of these vascular bundles it's called the xylem. The outer layer is called the phloem. The xylem is the vascular tissue that transports water and minerals, usually upward. Because how does a plant get water? Yeah, from the roots. So the roots can absorb this water. It can move into the xylem, and then it can be moved up higher into the plant to wherever it needs to go.
When it says like transports minerals, is that like minerals that are like in the water?
Yeah, that are dissolved in the water, things like phosphorus and nitrogen, nutrients that the plant needs. To help you to remember, because sometimes people get confused about which tissue carries what material, right before X in the alphabet is
W.
W,
Oh.
because the xylem carries water. Phloem. The phloem is another tube that runs sort of next to the xylem. And the phloem is what carries sugars throughout the plant. So the phloem is this outer layer. If we think about, let's say, a maple tree, where is most of the sugar in a maple tree made?
The sugar house.
You know?
That'd be pretty
What
cool.
process produces sugars? Yes, photosynthesis. Where does most photosynthesis happen?
Leaves.
In the leaves. Okay? So the leaves at the top of a maple tree are producing sugar, but all of the various parts of the plant still need that sugar to get energy, so that material moves down through this flow. Sometimes it moves down to be stored when the leaves die. Sometimes it moves back up when that sugar needs to be used for energy in the springtime. And so what do people sometimes do?
They like tap
Yeah, tap into a maple tree. And if you hammer in a little metal tap, it enters into this tissue, the phloem, and then as that phloem is moving through the tree in the spring, some of that liquid comes out of the tap. You can collect it in a bucket or in tubing, boil away most of the water, and you're left with maple syrup. That maple syrup comes from the sugars produced in the maple tree. And so to help you remember, the phloem transports sugar, syrup ends with a P, phloem starts with a P, transports sugar. So, summarize, the xylem brings water, usually from the roots up to the leaves and other parts of the plant, while the phloem brings food, sugars, made in the leaves to all of the other cells. So you can actually do this. If you took a piece of celery and you put half of it, you split the stem in half, halfway down, and put one end in food coloring and water, it's red, and the other one in blue, what you'll see is it conducts that liquid up, and you see those vascular bundles. On one side will be red, and the other side will be blue. The leaves of a plant, what's their purpose? You just said it. Photosynthesis. The leaves have typically a large surface area, which they can use to capture the sun's energy. The leaves are where most of the chloroplasts are found. They also take in gases. So if you look at the leaves of a plant under a microscope, this is what you might see. What you'll notice is that besides the cells here, with the nucleus in them, you see these little circular things. These are structures that are called stomates. A stomate is an opening in the leaf. What gas does it need to allow in? Carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide goes in through these small openings into the interior of the leaf, where it can then be used by the chloroplast for photosynthesis. Also, when those stomates are open, water can escape. So there are some times when a plant will close those stomates to conserve that water. For example, on a very hot, dry day, a plant might close those stomates because it's losing too much water and there's a chance it might dehydrate. And then it might open those later on when the sun's not as intense or in the evening to allow that carbon dioxide in. So it's one way for plants to maintain homeostasis in terms of their water balance. Lucia, did you have a question?
Yeah, what about plants like non-green?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So what makes most leaves green?
Chloroplast.
Yeah, well, chloroplast. And in chloroplast, there is a pigment, a colored molecule called chlorophyll, and it's green. But there are other pigments that plants use to capture the sun's energy. Some of them are red, some of them are yellow, some are orange. For example, these leaves on this plant over here, they're kind of purplish in color. They're not green, they have some green in them, but the primary pigment this plant uses, that has those hanging leaves, it uses other pigments that are purplish in color to capture the sun's energy. Most plants use chlorophyll as their main pigment, but you do see, but even a maple leaf, even though it looks green, there are other pigments inside of it to capture different wavelengths of light. When do you actually see those?
Fall.
Yeah, when the leaf starts to die and it's going to be shed, the chloroplast dies off first, and then you're able to see the underlying pigments that are still there.
Does can the stomate work like a contract out of Advil where if there's excess water it can squeeze some out?
No, it doesn't squeeze, it just basically opens or closes. So, but it would open if there's plenty of water, it would open because you don't need to conserve water. Because if it's closed, it can't take in carbon dioxide, but it saves water, so it's kind of a trade-off. All right, let's talk about plant reproduction. We're going to spend a lot of time on plant reproduction. So people don't really think about it in this way, but plants actually reproduce sexually. And so how do plants reproduce sexually? You're like, oh, I don't know, that seems kind of weird. Well, they do it without, in a way that's different sort of than most animals. Plants, for sexual reproduction, just like in other organisms, it requires two parents. The offspring can be a blend of characteristics from each parent. But also sometimes plants can reproduce asexually. And as in other organisms, asexual reproduction, only one parent organism is involved, and it basically produces copies of itself. Here we have, I don't know, it's like goldenrod, where you have a goldenrod plant, but popping out from its roots that are growing underground are other plants. Now, they're really the same plant. They're genetic copies. They share the exact same DNA as this plant, but they are their own plant, even though they're genetically identical. So that's a form of asexual reproduction. Grass often grows like this, and lots of other plants. We'll talk about them eventually. The grass can grow little stems under the ground and pop up a new plant. So flowering plants are called angiosperms. Okay. Angiosperms are plants that produce flowers. And what a flower actually is, it is the male and female reproductive organs of a plant. Yes. So when you present in the next couple months your mother with a beautiful bouquet of flowers, what you are really presenting to her is a collection of the harvested reproductive organs of some plants.
I don't give my
When
mom
you smell
flowers.
a flower leaf,
Yeah,
you're smelling their stuff.
Smelling children.
Yes, they are reproductive organs.
You're
So,
smelling their special husband.
Flowers are reproductive structures. And fertilization takes place in flowers. And often then, what do flowers turn into after fertilization?
They turn into bugs before. I don't know.
Dead
Dead?
maggots.
Nope. You're close, because this contains seeds, fruits. Okay?
What?
Flowers often form fruits, which have seeds, and we'll talk a lot about fruit in a little bit, but fruits have a function. That's important to the survival of plant species. No, it's a seed. All right, so we're going to talk about the actual structures, because in a flower, there might be male reproductive structures, there might be female reproductive structures, there might be both. But the parts, when you look at a flower, the main visible parts that you might notice at first are the leaves that are sort of underneath the flower, supporting it. Those are called the sepals,
Oh, those would be sepals.
sort of the base of the flower. And then the sometimes colorful,
Flamboyant.
modified leaves that are used for various purposes, sometimes to attract animals, are called the petals. And just like other organisms that reproduce sexually, there are special reproductive cells that are combined during sexual reproduction to form the offspring. They're called gametes. In animals, they're called gametes as well.
That's a great name.
So in animal cells, the male gamete is within a pollen grain, and it's a sperm cell, just like it is in animals. A sperm cell is the male gamete, the male reproductive cell. It's held within pollen. So I'm sure you've heard of pollen. Sometimes you might come outside in the spring and your driveway's covered in green or yellow pollen. Some of us are allergic to pollen. What that really is the male reproductive cell. Pollen is kind of like plant sperm. The sperm cell's actually in the pollen grain, but they're pretty much equivalent. There's also female reproductive gametes. Just like in animals, their females produce egg cells. In plants, there are egg cells as well. They're held within the ovule of a plant. And so when a pollen grain lands on the reproductive structures in a female plant, then fertilization has taken place. So fertilization is when that pollen grain from a male reproductive structure lands on the stigma, the female reproductive structure. The sperm cell travels into the ovule, fertilizes an egg cell, and then a little baby plant is born.
I still can't get over it's called the gamete. What's it called?
The
Gamete.
Oh, the
Gamete.
gamete. I like gamete better.
So there are, it depends on the type
Nice
of,
to gamete.
depends on the type of flower, but some flowers contain both male and female reproductive parts. Some contain only male, some contain only female. It depends on the species of plant, actually. So the male reproductive organs in a flower is called the stamen. There's usually several stamens in a flower. It contains two parts. There's the filament, which is sort of the stalk that holds it up. And then at the tip of that stalk is an area where the pollen grains are actually produced. The anther is where the pollen grains are produced. Remember, the pollen grains contain the sperm. The filament sort of holds it. So if we look at this top diagram, these little stalked things, those are the stamens of this flower. The female reproductive structures are called the pistil. And And so this central part of this flower is the whole thing is called the pistil. That's the female reproductive organ. And they're made of several parts. The top part is called the stigma. This is where a pollen grain could land for pollination.
I almost wrote pollen.
The elongated part is called the style. That keeps the stigma elevated in the flower. And then at the base is an enlarged area that's called the ovary. And just like in animals, the ovary is the organ that produces the egg cell. So the egg cells of this plant are held at the base of the pistil. Pollen grains are made at the tips of these anthers. So if you ever sort of look closely at a flower, you probably have seen these different parts. Like, for example, if we look at this lily, it looks like a daylily.
That's me.
So these grow around here a lot. You might see them, they grow in like wet ditches, they might be outside near the road. And so if we look at this, this plant has 6 stamen. You can see each of them have the anther at the end held up by the filament. Then it has 1 pistil in the middle, the stigma on top, the style, and then the ovary in the bottom, which contains, in this case, 6 ovules, each of which could be pollinated, could be fertilized. So let's look at some actual pictures. And then, so flowers typically go through phases. When a flower is first starts to grow, it's sort of all closed up, usually like this. These protective green leaves, those are the sepals. As the flower matures, it sort of opens up. The petals are exposed. And the petals are called accessory parts because really they aren't necessary for sexual reproduction in the plant. Often their role, why are flowers brightly colored often? Picture? Yeah, because often plants use animals to help them spread their pollen from one plant to another. So colorful petals are one way that plants can attract pollinators to them. As the petals open up and the sepals open up, that exposes the reproductive structures, male and female. And so here you can see in this flower the different phases. Closed up, petals are sort of opening up, and then once they're fully opened, we can see the reproductive structures that are inside of them. This is a tulip. So this is a close-up. So again, you see the petals that are on the outside. We could see the 6 stamen in this case. This is the pistil. And you could see on the anthers of these stamens, you can see sort of powdery yellow stuff. Those are individual pollen grains. This is the stigma of the pistil. So this is where pollen grains could land and pollinate this flower. Here's another flower. This is a lily. You can see this green and bluish part. That's the pistil. And here you have 6 stamen. The stamen also go through sort of phases. They emerge, they grow, eventually the pollen grains start to form, and then basically they fall off. So we have this term pollination. Pollination is the process by which the pollen grains from the male structures are transferred from the anther to the pistil or the stigma of the female parts of the flowers. Now, you might think, well, that's kind of simple. Like, here's the anther, which is producing pollen. Here's the stigma, where that pollen has to land. Doesn't it just, like, fall onto here and pollinations happen? Well, that sometimes happens. That's called self-pollination. When one individual plant pollinates itself, that's called self-pollination. But most plants have ways of avoiding this. Can you guess why would they want to avoid self-pollination?
Variety?
Yeah, exactly. Because what is one of the benefits to organisms of sexual reproduction?
They have the best adaptation.
Yeah, there's differences, right? It increases variations so that you have a wide variety of types of living things that can survive changes and so forth. Well, if an organism is self-pollinating, well then there's no new variation that's being added. So most plants have adaptations that encourage what we call cross-pollination. This is when pollen from one flower pollinates another. So once a pollen grain actually lands on the stigma, it grows a long tube into this part of the ovary, and then the sperm cell travels through that tube and actually fertilizes one of those ovules. So cross-pollination is favorable because it adds variation, as we just said. Variety is sort of the raw material of evolution, of natural selection. You need differences in order for natural selection to work. You remember, natural selection starts with variation. And there's a struggle for survival. And eventually the reproduction of the successful organisms. And that leads to adaptations development. So how would you think, what are some ways a plant can avoid self-pollination? Can you think of adaptations plants might have? How?
The anther, or whatever, how we say, like, are heard out instead of in.
Okay. Sort of maybe the shape or the size or where they're located. That's a good idea. And that sort of goes along with number one. Not so much of the shape or the direction it's pointing, but the timing. In most plants, the stamen and pistil don't develop at the same time. They don't mature at the same time. Okay? If the stamen and the stigma were both mature at the same time, self-pollination probably would happen very commonly. Right? The wind would blow, some pollen fall on the stigma, and then it self-pollinates. But usually the pistil and the stamen don't mature at the same time. So even if pollen did land on the pistil, it wouldn't pollinate it because that female parts aren't ready yet. Another adaptation is having imperfect flowers. Some flowers don't have male and female parts inside of one flower. They have male flowers, like this, and female flowers, like this. And therefore, it's less likely that self-pollination will happen because the reproductive structures are in different flowers. Some plants are even, they have male plants and female plants. Some types of trees, for example. One tree will have only male flowers on it, and another separate tree would have only female flowers on it. There's also biochemical means that the pollen and the stigma are just not compatible in the same individual. So cross-pollination is important. Because it increases variation. So I guess let's hold off. We'll talk about adaptation to how pollen is spread from plant to plant as we move into this on Wednesday.
We're gonna fill this line